welcome back to Monster Head to Head, a design podcast for Dungeons and Destiny, where we take the monsters of the Destiny universe and we make them fight each other for the top spot on the CR chart. And I am Good Game Kitty. I'm the creator of Dungeons and Destiny.
I'm Martin, the lead writer and editor for Dungeons and Destiny.
I'm Baxter, the founder of the Ishtar Collective.
And there's been a bit of work that's happened since our last episode. We had left off just starting with the Cabal, but in the interim, Martin has gone through and taken a bunch of the more basic monsters, and he's gone and he's slapped them onto the CR chart. So we've got significantly more monsters that have their CR. We'd love to sit here and go over like literally every single monster, but don't quite have enough recording time for all of that. So, Baxter, do you have any opinions about where things have been slapped?
Not really. I mean, looking at it's hard to see because there's quite a lot on there now compared to what was there before. I mean, I definitely think, it's interesting to see the progression from minions. It goes from like a Sentry Shank and Lava Worm at the 0 minion spot, and then Dreg and Shank, and then War Beast. So it does feel as though they're getting progressively more difficult, which makes sense. I guess I would have expected to see Scion on the minion list, but
Really?
it looks like it. Well, I don't know.
I'm
No,
glad you
actually,
brought
we
up
discussed
Scion.
this. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I was here for that discussion. Yeah.
No, that was one of the ones Martin did. So.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So Martin put the Scion at a CR2 Elite, which, for context, puts that on the same level as the Repeater Shank, and it is one step below a Sniper Vandal. And I personally,
which does make sense.
Well, see, I thought Scions were going to be a bit higher CR than that. Aren't they supposed to be like super cool mental attacker peoples?
I mean, I guess from a lore, I mean, it's weird because when you look at it from a lore perspective, nobody in the lore is described apart from dregs and shanks. Nobody's really described as being weak. Everybody has some abilities, or I guess from a gameplay perspective, I was just thinking generally in almost every encounter you can defeat a Scion in a single punch. And that's kind of a gameplay mechanic in a lot of areas, like on the Leviathan and places. So I guess it's less that I don't have a problem with the CR2 Elite. That makes sense. But I guess I would have, rather than putting it as an elite, I probably would have thought it was a minion or a soldier. But I mean, that's the only one that stands out. I think all of the other ones make a lot of sense.
Well, it's nice of you to say that, because first of all, I would like to disclaim that I have no confidence whatsoever.
Okay.
in where I have slapped all of these regular type monsters. I tried to think through where they would make sense to go, both in terms of how I felt they stood individually lore wise, and in terms of their relative position to other things on the chart. But putting monsters on this chart by myself was a very good illustrative exercise as to why it is so much better to do this collaboratively like we've been doing, because I'm sure that some of my decisions beyond just the Scion are questionable in one way or another, and I think the multi-directional feedback of having multiple minds, especially Kitty, your mechanical insight as the main designer of the tabletop side of things, is really important to getting these placements right. So I hope where I put these things kind of works out, but I also completely expect that most of them need to be adjusted in one way or another, except Sentry Shank and Hive Larva Worm, which I stand by as CR0 minions, because they literally cannot hurt you.
I think the Larva Worm, it has a -2 to its attack rolls, meaning it's so bad at attacking. And it does
Larva Worm goes ooh woo and tries to bite your boot.
Yeah, exactly. It goes Ooh woo, what's this? Tries to bite it, ends up missing.
Yep.
Bites
That
the
sounds
dirt
really,
instead.
really
To
cute.
the scion itself, I'll just speak to that one as an example of thought process in placing things where I did. Scions are, if you think of a typical Cabal squad that drops out of a thresher, in a patrol zone, or that you come upon occupying a room, in a mission or something, you usually have a handful of Cabal troops made of a mix of legionaries and phalanxes, maybe a gladiator or two, maybe a centurion in charge of things, and a smaller set of scions.
Mm.
And obviously, that's not universally the case. Sometimes you get a bunch of scions, but if what usually comes out of a thresher is like 3 or 4 legionaries, 1 or 2 other Cabal type units like the Phalanx or the Centurion or an Incendior, and then like 2 to 4 scions in that mix. So I wanted to put them in one of the thinner tiers to represent that in a mix of Cabal
Yeah.
monsters, the scions are usually a minority of the deployment group.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense when you put it like that. I can see the logic behind it. It does make me wonder, should Acolyte maybe be under Soldier in that case?
Maybe I can talk about acolytes in a minute too, but the other thing about the scions is that we have 2 other scion variants on the list of things.
Yeah.
I placed one of which we call the headhunter scion, which is just a scion sniper named after that headhunter rifle they use, and the other I
Creation of my
guess is
own.
based. Is it not based on the D1 scions with the arc damage, or is it
It's a
your
little
own
bit based on that,
adaptation?
yeah.
Okay, well we have a slightly customized scion, the striker scion, who's more of a psychically beat 'em up scion, and so there was the question of where does a basic scion go, but then where does it go in relation to these 2 specialized scion types? And I ended up deciding to put the Headhunter Scion at CR4 Elite. So like the basic Scion, an Elite, but a couple
Deadlier.
ranks up. Yeah, because of the whole snipey thing. And in doing that, I was trying to consider how to place it in relation to the other sniper type monsters we have. So I ended up deciding that a headhunter scion would be deadlier than a sniper vandal by 1 CR because they're friggin' psychic.
Yeah, they got this. Yeah, they might only have 1 eye, but they have like 4 more in their brains. So you get rid of the
they
3rd eye, get ready for the 5th.
they can see the future. So I figured they might be able to snipe a little better than even a vandal who's a skilled sniper is still not psychic.
Yeah.
Versus the tracer shank, which is sort of a sniper unit, but a shank, which
baby.
we have over over at CR3 soldier. So those 3 kind of form a little triangle of sniping on the table. And then meanwhile, the striker scion I put at CR5 soldier along with the phalanx, kind of figuring that based on my sense of what this new type of scion is supposed to be, that the phalanx is tough at about that level because of the annoying defensive capability of that shield, whereas the striker scion is tough at a comparable level because it's small, they move really fast, again, can see the future and stuff. So like imagine boxing against a tiny, skinny little person that is psychic and knows what you're going to do before you decide to do it.
So
And like that's kind of what I was thinking writing one of those would be like.
It's like that scene from Sherlock Holmes 2 with Robert Downey Jr., except
Discombobulate,
it's
exactly.
very small.
Yes.
Anyways.
Yes. I don't know if those placements hold up, but I did try to think through how to put things in places.
It's interesting to hear your explanation for where you put things.
But anything that anybody thinks should move for any reason, I am not attached to the decisions I made here, so I want to hear about it.
I want to bring up something before we start discussing that, though, and that is something that I don't remember if we've talked about it in the previous episodes or not, but when you are determining a monster's CR, What you actually do is you calculate 2 CRs. You calculate 2 different challenge ratings. You calculate its offensive challenge rating and its defensive challenge rating, and then you average the 2. And you could have a monster with an offensive challenge rating of 3, but a defensive challenge rating of 1, which means that its final CR would end up being 2. So when you're looking at monsters, it's not necessarily just the overall abilities of it that you need to take into consideration. It's kind of deciding what matters more, the offensive or the defensive one, and then trying to give it a CR closer to that aspect of the monster. And to sort of illustrate what I mean by that is that one of the monsters we had on here that we had actually talked about on a previous episode, which was the Phalanx. Phalanx was originally pinned as, a CR3 Elite, and then, because it was a lower tier than Legionary. But the thing is with the Phalanx, when it has that giant shield, and mechanically, what that shield provides, because there's already rules for how shields work in 5e, so that shield actually bumped its CR, just that shield alone, bumped its CR up to CR5. And you could balance that out by reducing the offensive power or reducing the HP of the Phalanx, but it felt a little bit weird that the Legionary and the Phalanx use the same guns, and they are the same creature, and it just felt really weird to have one, you get this gear upgrade is kind of what I imagine the shield is. You have some form of extra training to get to use that shield, and that makes you physically weaker when you really need to actually be strong to wield a shield that big. So the Phalanx's CR actually ended up getting bumped up, just because of its defensive aspect and how that part of its monster is designed. And when we're looking at monsters like Scion, and also the Bombshank is another example of this, a Bombshank itself is probably physically very weak, but how strong is that explosion? And that's kind of what we should be using to judge its CR. And so just keeping that in mind when we're looking over these monsters here, that CR is a little bit more complicated than it is on the surface, but don't worry too hard about it. Don't worry too hard about it. So if we're going to Scion, and physically, they are very weak creatures. Like, yeah, you one punch and they're dead. There are some Shanks that take 2 punches, and yet the Scion doesn't. But how strong is that attack of the Scion?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't hugely disagree with Scion being where it is. I guess it's just I did kind of expect it in the minion or maybe the soldier column, but I think it makes sense for it based on what you've said. I think you've made it's a good justification for why, even though a Scion might have poor defense, they do potentially have a lot of skill and a powerful attack. I don't think it's like wrong or anything. I just hadn't thought of it like that before.
Well, where would you put it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably maybe in the soldier column, but probably not CR2. Probably a little bit like higher CR. But I mean, I feel like it's splitting hairs a little bit.
It could be, and also our next topic here, which has absolutely nothing to do with individual monsters, might make it completely moot. And that is, looking at the table here and looking at all the monsters that we have listed, that's a lot of them. We've got, Tracer Shanks on here, we've put Fanatics on here, we've got Silent Fangs and Knights and Shriekers, Wizards have been added, Colossi, Ogres, all that fun stuff is up on this table. And basically everything is clumped. I would say the average CR of this entire table is very strongly CR3 or CR4. And there's not a whole lot of deviation from that range, which narratively makes sense. Like, narratively, I don't have actually any problems with any of the placements here. I mean, I was surprised by a couple of them, but you think about it for a little bit, it works out. It works out. But we do have to step back for a moment, and we kind of have to look at this on a macro level, and we have to consider the realities of what we're dealing with, which is the medium of the game, and that is tabletop game. This is not a video game. This is a game where all of these monsters are going to be played by a human being who is going to be sitting down on the other side of a little cardboard cutout that is dividing their roles from the players' roles, and they have to decide what all of these creatures are going to be doing in a fight or in an exchange of dialogue or whatever the encounter might end up being. And you have to think about players are going to be playing Guardians at levels, outside of level 4 to 5. They're going to be playing Guardians at 10th level and at 15th level and at 20th level. And, well, 20th is the current cap. I know there are some GMs or architects out there who homebrew higher levels for Guardians, but officially 20 is the cap. And when you have, say, a party of 15th level Guardians, we have nothing in that CR 15 range. If they wanted to go up against, say, a number of legionaries that would make it a fair fight, that's a lot of legionaries. It's a lot. That's a lot of monsters to expect a human being to keep track of. That's a lot of initiatives that need to be rolled. That's a lot of hit points that need to be tracked. That's a lot of wants and desires that need to be role played.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Which is that, for example, we don't have any taken on the board yet.
Yeah.
So is your goal to have monsters from every race be usable in every scenario? Or would it be okay? Could you say, well, taken are enhanced versions of each of the other races that they are pulled from? So if we left the existing ones where they were, or roughly where they were, is it acceptable to have things like the taken be placed on this, and for those to all have a higher CR rating? And equally things like the scorn as well.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, my goal as a designer is not for every creature to be viable at every level, because one of the other realities we have to work with here is space. We could make a stat block for an acolyte at every meaningful minion level. That's going to take up a lot of space, though. And unless it is a different creature, it's not really worth it to put in all of the effort to make a whole new stat block for it when a little blurb that says, increase the damage and HP by this amount to get the elite version of this character or creature. So my goal is not to have every creature available at every level. My goal is for architects to have a viable encounter at every level. And what I mean by that is that at every level, the architect has an option for a reasonable amount of minions to use in an encounter, or a reasonable amount of soldiers to use in an encounter. It means that, because on our chart here, just to describe it for the people who can't see it, we have the CRs listed out. They actually go all the way up to CR 30, because even though players cap at 20, monsters can go all the way up to 30. And we have these dividing lines within the CR brackets of the system. And those are CR 0 to 4, CRs 5 to 10, CRs 11 to 16, and then 17 plus. It technically goes 17 to 20, and then it goes 21 plus, but don't worry about that too much, because things get weird once you get to CR 21 or higher. They get really weird. Anyways, so my goal is for that if an architect has a party of characters who are, say, in the CR 11 to 16 block, there are viable encounters for that block that do not require the architect to run 52 legionaries, plus 8 centurions and 3 Goliaths to actually be able to challenge the party. It's that we have monsters spread out and usable, not necessarily all the same though. So having monsters, or having viable options for monsters within all of the CR brackets. And to do that, we can do one of two things. We can either look at what we have right now, and we can unclump what we have right now, and we can spread out the factions, because I would love to do it by faction. I'd love to say, Fallen are mostly CR 0 to 4, and they scale up from there. And then, as just an example, maybe Vex start at CR 5 and they scale up from there. And we can talk about the narrative implications of having monsters that the weakest Vex requires a Guardian at 5th level or higher to make it a fair fight. The other way to do it is to make a ton of new monsters. And there are pros and cons to both.
So I think you did a really good job there of explaining why the clumping is an issue, because I guess it means that the more spread out they are, the more options an architect has for designing a scenario. The less spread out they are, then, I mean, yes, the architect doesn't necessarily have to pick them, but it means there's a lot of overlap. And so if they want to say, okay, I want a more difficult scenario, they're limited in their choices. They can't, like you say, there's a lot of from maybe 0 to 6 even. There's enough variety there, but beyond that, it starts to get quite thin.
Yeah, and to sort of jump off what you said there about variety and options, also a fun fact, architects don't actually have to use the monster as the monster that is presented. It's not uncommon for architects or just GMs or DMs or anyone doing any TTRPG that's got stat blocks whatsoever. You take a monster stat block and you literally just reskin it and reflavor it to make a completely new monster. And I've got this whole thing where I love telling new architects, like, hey, do you want to watch me make 3,000 new monsters in 6 seconds? Watch, Control F, find and replace. Because the players, they don't see the stats. And the way that the game works, it's all dice rolls, there's randomness that's thrown into here. They're not gonna know. They're not gonna know.
Well, they are now that you're telling them on this recorded podcast.
I mean, this is for architects only. Obviously, no players are ever going to listen to this. That's fine.
Obviously.
No players listen to this. But just as a real world example, as I wanted to, for one Halloween session, I want to throw a party through a haunted house that's got animated suits of armor that attack them and everything, but there's only one stat block for an animated armor in 5e. But there's stat blocks for bandits, there's stat blocks for wizards, there's stat blocks for rogues. All you gotta do is say it is just describe them as animated rogue armor instead, and the stat block works just fine. So having things spread out, even if we say a goblin is a CR6 minion or whatever, the architect doesn't necessarily have to say that is a goblin, but they have a CR6 minion block that they can use. So, let's talk about this, the first question that we have to deal with here, which is, do we want to spread out what we have? And we can talk about if you wanted to divide it up by faction, and, what factions would be stronger than other factions and so on, and maybe Taken do end up in that CR 11 to 16 range because Taken and so on. Or do we want to make a crap ton of new monsters?
I do kind of have this sense that the monsters we have, not only are they clumped together a bit, but I sort of feel like the overall difficulty curve that is charted out in this table might be a little low. But I definitely hear what you're saying, Kitty, about needing there to be monsters to facilitate encounters at whatever CR. So it's not like we can empty out the bottom of the CR curve, but I do wonder, what kind of monsters do we need to provide for the kinds of encounters that are most likely for architects to set up for lower level players, right? Do we need all of this variety of specialized monsters below CR5 at all? Or is it enough that we have a smattering of minions from different factions and maybe a few soldiers and an elite or two to function as the effective mini-bosses for low-level encounters? And then we kind of shift all the variety up, regardless of whether we're going to sort of separate out this or that faction as generally stronger than this or that other faction. So that's kind of my first question is could we push the whole thing up a fair ways, almost sort of separately from the question of how clumped it is in the middle right now?
I mean, we definitely could. There's nothing really stopping us from doing that. The implications of doing that, though, it has to go... Again, we're going to be judging this based on narrative, because as much as we can sit here and talk about mechanics or everything, at the end of the day, TTRPGs are narrative games. And
for sure,
if we take our Fallen Captain and we change it from a CR5 elite to a CR7 elite, does that still narratively make sense given what a 7th level Guardian is supposed to represent?
And my short answer to that question broadly is I kind of think it does, or at least it can, if we adopt the narrative stance that we've already sort of adopted to some extent of looking at what the world of Destiny and the monsters in it are like from the perspective of lore that paints. What's that?
I was gonna say from the perspective of, your average pilgrim human.
Yeah, exactly. So like not even that. Like, let's look at the whole saga of lore entries about Reza Lazir, who becomes
boy.
Dredgen Yor after becoming corrupted by Hive influence. And there are like 3 or 4 entries in that series that describe how before anyone was aware of the Hive being on the moon, he goes to the moon and goes down into the catacombs and has an absolutely harrowing fight against swarms of thrall, a knight, and one named wizard. So and Reza Lazir at this time is like top-notch guardian involved in the founding of the city, not a like relatively new but competent guardian, like a legendary guardian at that time. And he's running out of bullets fighting off Hive. He's really getting himself in a tight spot going up against a knight, et cetera, et cetera. And we can't that direction too much because then we have all of the monsters being as scary mechanically as they are occasionally described, which makes everything more difficult than we want it for gameplay reasons. But we talked about already how we're adopting a stance that is already separate from the sense of difficulty of enemies in the video game, where most every enemy is trivial because of the mechanical framework of how we interact with the setting in the video game. Destiny, the video game, can throw 50 legionaries at you to challenge you because it can control all of that. Yeah, exactly. They might start teleporting around a little bit, but never mind.
That's your connection, okay? That's your connection with the light, aka your ISP. Anyways.
Right. So we've already recognized that we're sort of digging our feet in a different position in terms of what the difficulty of all the many enemies of humanity should be like. And I think I said this was the short answer, but here I am talking 5 minutes later. I think we can double down on that a bit if we want to push up most of the variety of monsters we've already charted.
What if we did a little bit of both? Because I definitely agree with what you're saying. If you imagine this is like Photoshop or something, we could just select these and we could just drag it, and some of them will pop in. Do you know what I mean? Like we could stretch it.
No, I'm almost even thinking of literally selecting all of the cells from the soldier column over and moving them like 2 or 3 rows up the CR chart and see how that looks and adjust from there.
Yeah, so we definitely could do that. But
we definitely could. I'm just imagining like it's just all right.
Kitty's sitting here. Look how they massacred my boy.
No, I'm imagining it's like you're in a gymnasium and everything, and you've got the students. All right, I need everyone over here. Just take 2 steps to the left. Come on, we're gonna see if we get this just right.
All right, everybody from the wretches to the Kells. I'm gonna need you to step up 2 or 3 rows.
Right. All right. So we definitely could do it.
So we could do that. But what if we were to say, if we were to rank it so that, maybe, I don't know if this makes sense because, if you look at the order that we meet these races in Destiny 1, you could make the argument that the order, this is just one possibility, could be Fallen, and then Hive, and then Vex, and then Cabal. Right. Let's not get hung up on whether that's the correct order or not. But let's say we decided those were the rough rank of those different races. We could still stretch it out. It's just that we could stretch out the. I think it's still good to have quite a bit of overlap, but we could just stretch out the. We could pull the Cabal down, increase the Cabal CR rating slightly more than we increase the Vex, which is slightly more than we increase the Hive. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to sort of separating the enemy factions into different difficulty bands like that. I'm just
I think it would be
about how we decide what the order is.
Yeah, and I think it would be a shame if they were really clearly banded. Like if the top, if the
your Fallen ends at CR4, and that's exactly where Hive begins. That would not
Yeah,
be
yeah.
that's obviously
satisfying
no
in the
good.
slightest.
Yeah, I think it's good that they have quite a bit of overlap amongst each other, quite a lot of overlap even. But I think stretching it would be good. I think it would be. I'd like to see where the Taken would be on this list, and then stretch the other ones to meet the Taken potentially. I don't know.
Well, I've added a new tab. It's called Faction Scaling, and I thought we could do a
Oh,
short
oh,
exercise, a really short exercise. If we go over to this new tab, it's the same thing as a CR chart, except instead of having minion, soldier, elite, major, or ultra, it's got our factions in here. And I thought we could maybe this might help if we took a few minutes to just highlight, and I do mean literally click and drag and highlight something like that, the sort of where we expect the average or the greatest curve of the bell curve of this faction to land.
yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously there are going to be outliers because of ultras, but yeah, I think that would be really cool.
But when just looking at the average strength of the faction and what the, pick a conglomerate of your representatives of it, where do they roughly land? And being able to see a scaling in this way on a very macro level might help us decide how we want to manage individual creatures on a micro level.
Yeah. I almost wonder as well with some of these. I was just kind of thinking, like with the Vex, for example, they're an interesting one because sometimes they are seen as like an annoyance, whereas sometimes they are seen as the greatest risk to our existence that could ever possibly exist. Like there's this huge, I don't know if discrepancy is the right word, but there's a huge variation, I suppose, is the
Yeah.
word
Yeah,
in how much of a threat they're seen as. The Cabal as well. Out of all of our opponents, the Cabal have come the closest to defeating
killing
us. Yeah. So you could argue that they are the most dangerous, except of course now Keitel is saying, well, we need to ally because we can't defeat the Hive.
Well, we need to ask the question of, are they dangerous because the average unit is dangerous, or are they dangerous
Yes. Yeah.
because there's a crap ton of them?
Yeah,
Mm.
and that's definitely, I think that's a good argument for, the Vex. They just seem to have an absolutely almost unending supply of time traveling robots that they can throw at a problem.
So I was
Yeah.
just gonna say, so if we just as an example to start maybe kicking this off a little bit, let's just say that Vex for our average units, so goblins, harpies, minotaurs, cyclops, that sort of thing. What if we highlight CRs 1 through 6 is what I picked here, which means those units will fall roughly within this range. And, there will be outliers and there will be special units. You might even be able to say something like, I don't know, maybe your average Hydra is actually a CR10. But, picking a range for the average Vex unit, and we're just looking at the most common units in the faction, and then individual Vex, such as Brachion and stuff like that, they can end up being pretty high CR by themselves.
And so
then,
is that where you think the Vex would land?
That's where I'm willing to start the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's
Put the Vex higher.
You want to put the
yeah,
Vex
I
higher?
would.
All right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you can come up with pretty good excuses to put any race anywhere because of different storylines that have
Sure.
happened in different lore. But I think since what we're trying to do is find a good balance between the narrative side of things and the gameplay side of things, I think I would probably put the Vex higher.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
where would you say is the minimum CR for a Vex?
5 is neat.
Okay.
Depending on where we put the
Yeah.
other bands, I could see them starting even higher than that. But
Yeah.
All right.
I don't want to get too
Yeah.
overboard.
If the question is where we put the other bands, all right. How about this? Which faction starts at CR0?
The Fallen.
Fallen. All right.
Because they
So then we're
got
starting with
Sentry
Fallen.
Shanks. They're the enemies that have been all over Earth the longest. They're the ones Guardians are best acquainted with fighting at any period in Destiny history where there are Guardians fighting aliens. It's at least including the Fallen.
All right. And I do kind of like how we have the scale of Fallen going from 0 to 10, because then this goes from Sentry Shank to Kel, and that covers the main forces that you would fight with the Fallen. And I do really like that scale that we had originally discussed in the previous 2 episodes.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point.
All right, so if the Fallen are there, what is the next highest faction? Not where does the next highest faction go, but what is the next highest one?
It sounds like, based on what we've already said, we're likely to agree it's either the Hive or the Cabal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's.
So I mean, this is a wrinkle, but at different points in the arc of Destiny's story, each of these factions is, for some period of time, the most dangerous. So
Yeah.
I think we're trying to step back from, well, the Cabal, the Red Legion Cabal almost wiped us out, versus, well, again, Crota almost, Crota killed more Guardians on the moon than blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
trying to take a wider perspective.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Like I said, with the introduction of the different races in Destiny 1, Bungie just had to make a decision about how are the enemies going to be introduced. And I think it makes sense to just say something similar. Like, even though the Hive, if you were to listen to, like I said, like Keitel at the moment is saying, we have to ally because we can't defeat the Hive, because the Hive just invaded the Cabal homeworld. That paints the Hive as being the big enemy. So I think just because we have to make a decision about where to put the races, I would say Hive, and I would say there should be quite a big overlap between the Hive and the Fallen. I'd maybe start at 3 or 4 down to maybe 12 or something. I don't know. What do you think?
So on the one hand, I appreciate just deferring to the order the enemies are introduced in D1, because that at least does ground it in something definite. But I think the Hive are more of a threat than the Cabal, and have consistently been so.
Well, I mean, look,
And I have one big, like, high level reason I say that, separate from, like, well, if you look at this expansion and that expansion, like, how many times have the Hive been the big bad versus the, like, a broader reason is that, at least to the extent we have ever fought them, the Cabal are conventional opponents. Which, I mean, they show up with armies, with guns that shoot bullets, or missiles, or they drop, pods made of physical stuff on your head.
Yeah.
And the threat they represent is a conventional military threat. And we know they have these Athenaeum worlds somewhere, and they probably have all kinds of freaky deaky, unconventional technology and weapons and paracausal assets somewhere that could crop up, but for the most part, they're just a big army. Whereas the Hive are the most space magical of our enemies, and they have been overall the most closely allied with the darkness itself, and their big bads are literal gods. And even if we manage to keep killing them, like, more of these god tier Hive leaders keep arising from their hierarchy, and they're fundamentally a paracausal threat.
Well, I think that's a fair point. But my only counterpoint to that would be, yes, in terms of them as a civilization, them as a species, I think that's a really fair point. Especially when you look at people like Oryx and Savathun and Xivu Arath. But if we're talking about just, like when you think about a thrall, a thrall is one of the weakest units in the game. And so while I agree that on an epic scale, if you take a step back, the Hive are definitely the biggest threat. In my opinion, they're the biggest threat that exists, even more so than the Vex. I still think that I would put them next lowest on the list, because yes, they're paracausal, but the majority of Hive
You're saying their strength comes from their numbers.
Well, not just their numbers. Yes, that is one thing. But the other thing is that the number of Ascendant Hive is but my expectation anyway is that it's relatively small. Like the vast majority of Hive are Thrall and Acolytes and Knights and the grunts that are doing the fighting, and then you have a smaller number of Ascendant Hive, which are like the really powerful ones. But I wouldn't be including the majority of those Ascendant Hive in the band of where the Hive sit. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't feel so strongly about it that I would disagree, but I would also be, if that's how we want to put the Cabal, I think we can find reasons to do it either way.
Yeah, it's, the narrative framework is always the
Yeah.
most flexible.
Yeah, I mean, gameplay can be pretty flexible too. Because I think I can't remember if I actually said this or not, but once you pick a CR for a monster, I will edit the monster stats to fit that CR.
Right.
So on our chart here, I just kind of picked a random range. I did a 10 range spread, same as the Fallen, but it goes from CR4 to CR14. My thoughts is, after listening to you guys debate about this, and then thinking back to oh god, Dredge and Yor, thinking back to that fella and the trials they had to go through, I was thinking wizards and stuff like that could be CR 13 or 14, maybe even as elites, if not majors, and that would make them a huge threat even to an experienced guardian, because that is the experienced tier.
So here's an idea for this banding
Mhm.
exercise that maybe will make both Baxter and me happy. These bands we're defining are, as we've said, not hard limits of the upper and lower CRs.
Oh god, no.
These factions monsters can be in. They're just kind of the typical range. So what if we put the Hive and Cabal bands in the same numerical range, but the Hive have farther stretching outliers than the Cabal do? So the Thralls are relatively weaker than the main body of the Hive CR band compared to, whatever the lowest CR Cabal unit, a War Beast probably is going to be. And on the other hand, like if it ends up being a wizard or something, wizards are higher out of the band. Just the outliers of the Hive can go further either way than the outliers of the Cabal.
And also keep in mind that 20 is technically the player cap. So anything above 20, that's going to be Atheon, that's going to be Crota, that's going to be monsters like that go above 20.
Sure.
And I was actually going to suggest putting the Cabal just 2 below. So they're very similar, but we have just enough mechanical difference to support the narrative of the Hive are a bit more deadlier.
I mean, that feels okay to me.
Yeah. So they're very similar. There's not a huge discrepancy between them, such as between the Fallen and the Hive, where, the Hive is a whole 4 CRs above the Fallen. It's just a little bit. It's just a little nudge. And do we have any strong opinions on Vex?
If we're going this route, I think we should push the Vex up like a bunch.
Like a bunch.
Like starting at 5.
We want to do starting at 5, so that'd be 5 to 15 if we're doing 10.
Yeah, and maybe they don't have to be 10, but ever since I started playing Destiny and started reading grimoire entries and stuff and began to understand what the Vex are like, I've always just been astounded at how dangerous they actually ought to be. Yeah. There's all these mentions of how infectious Vex code or memes can jump an air gap and infect a system that is supposedly physically isolated from a Vex system, or all the funny warnings about the Vex derived armor from Vault of Glass, about how you should inject anti-entheogens immediately if you start to experience godhood while wearing the Prime Zealot helm or whatever.
I'm looking forward to that going back.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much about this in the Beyond Light material about how Clovis Bray's entire ill-conceived Vex farming operation on Europa, surprise, gets infected by Vex code because they're, doing a bucket brigade of Vex milk and it gets on things and boilers, everybody turns into Vex or whatever. So I've always had this sense that the game requires things to play the way they do for its own design reasons, but narratively I've always felt the Vex are truly hazardous in a way that it's kind of hard to appreciate. So if we're approaching setting these CR bands like this, I'm sort of inclined to give them a good kick up the ladder, especially in light of, going back to D1, the fact they are actually the big bad of the original campaign.
Yes.
Elsie, who we know as the Stranger, shows up to warn us about the Vex, who Guardians have forgotten exist, basically, and really sound this alarm bell about what bad news it would be if they managed to get darkness powers from communing with the Heart of the Black Garden.
So, if I remember correctly, that mission starts when you are around 11th level, because in the original game you went from 1st to 20th level, and then you had to basically do prestige levels, which was you had to get tougher and better gear to level up beyond that. So what if, crazy thought, what if we actually bumped them up to a minimum CR7? So what I mean by that is, I would expect Goblin or Harpy to be around CR7.
I think for the purpose of spreading things out, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
But what if, just looking at it, we have 0, the Fallen start at 0, Cabal start at 2, Hive start at 4, maybe Vex could start at 6, just to complete the pattern and satisfy my...
Satisfy your personal desires? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I mean, that goes into game development too. Why not?
And, these bands we're filling in as hard-edged blocks, but they're really fuzzy brushstrokes.
Yeah.
And we might have a fanatic that's CR4 or whatever.
Right here, though, I think this is where we're going to have to end it, because we're coming up on time. And oh boy, we still have Taken, Siva, and Scorn to...
And we placed a total of checks notes 0 monsters today.
Well, I mean, that's we had to do a bit of a step back and some discussion, and this is just to all the architects out there, because obviously there's no players listening to this, so I'm speaking directly to the only people listening, which are the architects. This is just part of the development process, and if you're making your own module, every now and again you're gonna stop and you're gonna take a step back from your work. You're gonna be like, god damn it, I gotta redo the whole damn thing. And that's just how it be. I
think this is good though, and we'll get a better distribution out of this. And I think it's important that we're not just that we're doing a revision of what we already started doing, but that we're approaching this in a way that combines a fundamental assessment of the mechanical sense of difficulty with a fundamental assessment of the relative narrative threat posed by each of these factions. And I think that will result in a better set of monsters beating each other up.
Yeah. And as much as I would love to make 10 million stat blocks for everything, reducing the amount of work that actually has to be done, because it takes 1 hour to make one monster. But this is good. I am feeling very confident in what we've discussed here, and I am really looking forward to hearing Martin's scathing hot takes about Siva coming up.
I'm gonna put on my grumpy Saladin voice. That whole discourse.
But thank you all for listening to us today. We hope you learned something new about the absolute mess that is game development, and if you want to continue the discussion of any of the monsters or factions, I suppose, we talked about today, feel free to let us know your thoughts down in the comments. And be sure to check out the Dungeons and Destiny project at DNDestinyproject.com, and you can head over to the Ishtar Collective to read up on all of that lore that is probably going to come up real big in next episode.
Do your reading. Be well informed.
Yeah, get your homework done so that you can tell us how wrong we are in the middle of our episode next time.
Oh, I'll have to do my homework as well then.
Right? I'm over here. I'm rules development, man. I don't read. God. We'll see you folks around. Make good choices. Try not to die.